Good evening. Thank you so much for coming to our second CivicCon event tonight. It's wonderful to see a room filled with people who are ready to thoughtfully engage, solve problems, and build community. My name is Joe Stottleman, and I'm on the board of directors and the executive committee for Forward Janesville. I'm also the president of Angus Young Associates, architectural engineering, interiors, and landscaping firm, celebrating our 70th year here in Janesville. We've been involved and fortunate to be working on a lot of the local housing projects here in town, and we understand the deep commitment that all of us have and appreciate the community that we've built. Forward Janesville is the Chamber of Commerce and private economic development organization for the area. We were established in the early 90s when the Janesville Area Chamber of Commerce merged with the Janesville Economic Development Corporation to become Forward Janesville. The goal of this merger was to cultivate a strong local business environment so existing companies could grow and expand while new companies would have great reasons to start up and locate here. Having this traditional economic development activities embedded in the Chamber of Commerce has helped us ensure that businesses could be part of the leading the way on economic and local development in our town. And now I'd like to introduce the person who for us is leading the charge on our economic development efforts, Shar Hermanson, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction to Forward Janesville and everything that you do for the community and so many of you in the audience as well. I would like to thank everyone for coming out tonight and to formally acknowledge the public officials at the state and local level who are with us. I'll ask you to rise and be recognized at this time, please. I would like to thank our sponsors. Without them, this would not be possible. A big thanks to Quint and Rishi Studer, who really ignited the idea with CivicCon in Forward Janesville and said, we think that this should happen and we should help you guys do this. Then Ryan Inc. came on board, Tobin and Oakley Ryan, Massas Investments, the Janesville Gazette, JP Cullen, SSM St. Mary's Hospital, Janesville. Thank them for their support. As Joe mentioned, economic development is embedded in our chamber work. In our view, economic development is community development, and community development impacts all of us. Community development often starts with a conversation at a kitchen table, in a coffee shop, or at a popular breakfast spot, where people talk about what is and not possible, and what's working in their community. These conversations make their way to the workplace, schools and local government, and community spaces like this, one that we're in right now, the beautiful Janesville Performing Arts Center, inside the Marshall Apartments. If you don't know, the Janesville Performing Arts Center was once the Janesville High School. When our community outgrew that, it became Marshall Middle School. And then when our community outgrew that, it became an innovative adaptive reuse project that combined a performing arts space in downtown with housing. What a transformation. A transformation that began with a conversation about what's next for a building. CivicCon is short for Civic Conversations, and Forward Janesville is hosting these events so our community can learn together and share language around issues of importance to Janesville. Our January event focused on designing and planning communities so that we all have a better understanding of how places intentionally grow. If you missed that event, you can find that on our website, on Forward Janesville, on YouTube, and it's going to be on JATV, so accessibility is really great on that. That event focused on housing and will provide clarity on the concept, or this event, I'm sorry, focuses on housing, and the concept of affordability and how these concepts of supply, more housing, stability, tenant protections, and subsidy, funded affordable housing, will work together to deliver a housing market that works for all. Before we begin exploring our affordable housing tonight with our speaker, It's important to define a few terms. This is where some communities become stuck, so we would just want to level set that definition. So according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the definition of affordable housing is housing in which the occupant spends no more than 30% of their gross income on housing costs, which does include utilities. If housing is spent more than 30% on their gross income in utilities, then that household is considered burdened. To put that into the context of our community, the U.S. Census Bureau reports that the median household income for a family of 4 in Janesville is $73,446. Now, the definition of median is that some people are above that, and then some people are below it. That is the midpoint for our area. In order for a family to be living in an affordable home in Janesville based on that income, they cannot spend more than $22,000 a year or $1,800 a month on housing and utilities. Another layer of context of Janesville is the rapid increase in prices over the last 6 years. According to a study by the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater Fiscal and Economic Research Center that was commissioned by Forward Janesville, in April of 2025, the average home price in Janesville increased 56.7% between 2019 and 2024. The exponential increase in home prices in a short period of time has made local housing affordability even a more challenging problem. And lastly, we want to acknowledge the many ways that residents and businesses have vocalized their perspectives on the topics of housing and the headway that has been made. 95% of the respondents to the City of Janesville's Spring 2025 National Community Survey said affordable housing was the most needed type of housing in Janesville. 77% of the respondents to Forward Janesville's 2025 Business Retention Expansion Survey said housing environment needs improvement, with 21% of those respondents noting significant improvement. Housing and affordability and homeless services was the #1 concern of respondents in the Public Opinion Strategies poll in spring of 2026. In response, the City of Janesville made housing priority for all a priority in its 25 to 29 strategic plan and worked with the community on a potential mixed residential type housing plan on a plot of city-owned land at 2400 Beloit Avenue, right near Jackson Elementary School. And this is very exciting. Other communities would love to have an opportunity like this. Additionally, the city is working to provide more flexibility for mixed-use development and mixed residential development in the updates it's making to Janesville's zoning code. There was a huge win for second-floor residential development in downtown Janesville when the city announced their upper-floor livability loans and fire protection grants just a few weeks ago. Community problems require community solutions. With all this momentum, I am excited to introduce our speaker for tonight, Shane Phillips, author of The Affordable City, Strategies for Putting Housing Within Reach and Keeping It There. In the book, Shane argues for all of the above approaches to housing policy and outlines more than 50 strategies for improving affordability and household stability. Shane is the Housing Initiative Manager at the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he studies housing affordability, with particular focus on supply and policy design. His expertise includes zoning, development, and cost drivers. Shane, welcome. We are happy to have you here.
Didn't know this would be here. I guess I don't really need this thing, but it's already on. It's good to be here. Everyone hear me okay? Great. You know I'm glad to be here because I was willing to spend 9 hours at LAX to get here. I paid the price, but it's lovely to be here. It's actually my first time in Wisconsin, and so Char and Claire made me have cheese curds the first time we went out, and I'd had them before. Never had Wisconsin cheese curds though. Thumbs up, thumbs up. I approve, not that you need my approval. So thank you again for having me. Great to be here on a, what are we, Thursday night here? I'll start off just giving a little bit more background about me. I think it's useful just as context here. I grew up in Washington State, but came to Los Angeles a little over 12 years ago to continue my education after a long time off, and I've lived there since. I have a pretty unusual background, which I think informs a lot of my work today in maybe unexpected and unusual ways. I dropped out of high school, worked as a package loader at UPS, a cable installer at Comcast, returned to school and got my associate's degree, then got a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Washington, had plans to become a physician, worked in tuberculosis research for several years, took the MCAT, started applying to medical schools. But at a certain point, I'd been living in Seattle for several years by this point, I realized that it was not really medicine that I was passionate about, but urban planning. Just having lived in the city for a while really brought that out of me. I went back to school again, that's how I ended up in LA, worked on housing policy and consulting across the public and private sector, and I've been at UCLA in academia for almost 7 years now. So a lot of my work on housing has been focused on drawing connections between different policies and priorities, and on understanding how complex systems interact to produce both good and bad outcomes. So in that sense, I think what I do today actually has a lot in common with my history with biochemistry and biological research. And in a weird way, I think that's where my supply stability subsidy framework comes from, and it's why I tend to focus a lot on the details in my policy work, because they really do matter. For this presentation, though, there were some folks here who were at a workshop earlier today. I went really in the weeds, excessively in the weeds. This is going to stick to more high-level themes and ideas, and I think any more detailed questions people have, happy to answer those in the Q&A. I'll say that I am a researcher by trade. It's what I do with most of my time, day to day. But what I am really a lot more passionate about is sharing knowledge that comes from academia and other places with other people. Not even really so much in the school, I don't teach at UCLA, but really people like yourselves who are in a position to use the knowledge that is in academia, in think tanks, in the real world practical spaces, and use that to improve your own communities and the lives of the people around you. So on that note, I do want to do what I did with my last presentation at first as well, which is just to share a resource we've been producing at the Lewis Center for the past 5 years. I think is this on yet? Here we go. There we go. All right, so we've been producing a podcast called UCLA Housing Voice for 5 years now. We have 112 episodes, each about an hour long, and it's really aimed at sharing important findings from housing research, from books, from reports that's happening all across the world, but in an accessible, still admittedly very wonky fashion, but it really is intended for audiences like yours, people not in academia. And so, if the book is 50-something-ish recommendations that are each 2 or 3 or 4 pages. Here you've got twice as many episodes that are each an hour long. A whole lot more content if you're starved for any more after this. So UCLA Housing Voice has been really my biggest ongoing project professionally over the past 5 years. But before that, it was my book, The Affordable City. I wrote it as a sort of policy handbook on how to improve affordability. What to prioritize, what to avoid, case studies, things like that. And as I said, it features more than 50 policies in bite-sized chapters. Not the most compelling idea for a book. And so while researching and writing, I started really thinking about how all of these policies fit together. And that's where I came up with this idea, these themes of supply, stability, and subsidy, the 3 S's. The book is partly an argument for why all 3 should be prioritized, and partly a guide for how to actually do something with that, to make that happen in a practical sense. I suspect many of you do not deal with housing policy or housing development in your day-to-day, and kudos to you for being here despite that. But if the results of this recent poll are any guide, any indication, I'm quite sure that housing affordability is increasingly on your radar, personally, professionally, or both. I think we heard a survey poll that found something very similar actually in your own community, so I'm quite certain it's a growing issue for many of you. My hope here is just to give you a bit of a foundation, strengthen the foundation you already have, so that you can be more effective partners in the housing space, whatever your ambitions might be in that space. It might be getting more involved in policy reform, might be gaining some insight into how your work intersects and affects housing affordability. Maybe it will change your thinking a little bit on housing the next time it's on your ballot in some form in your neighborhood, or help you talk to others, your neighbors, your constituents, your friends and family, because that's really the only way any of this is going to get any better. In many communities across the US, housing is the most important issue to residents and voters, but that's actually a pretty recent development, and there's still a very long way to go on the public's understanding of the issue. And so that's actually the subject I'm going to conclude this presentation with. As I said, if nothing else, I just hope I can give you a few ideas or insights to help you talk to other folks about these issues. I think that's really the purpose of CivicCon. Even if you vehemently disagree with everything I have to say, that is often a very good starting point for a conversation. So I hope you'll at least listen, and we're welcome to have a conversation about it after. Before we go any further, though, I do want to address an elephant in the room that I feel obligated to address anytime I leave the state of California, which is why you have someone from California, of all places, to talk to you about making housing affordable. If anyone's interested, I have advice on traffic, on taxes. Any takers? No? I get the skepticism. I think it's completely fair to be a little skeptical. For those who are not aware, by some measures, Los Angeles is the most unaffordable metro area in America. It is reasonable then to wonder if there's really anything to learn from it, or from someone whose work is based there. My short answer to that is yes, there's actually a lot to learn from LA even, but most of it is as a cautionary tale. I am not here to tell you that Los Angeles has your answers, though I will say it is improving. I am really here to tell you to not be like Los Angeles, especially the LA of the past 50 years or so. Learn from our mistakes. Do not follow us down the same path. I have a longer answer, which is that LA's problems may seem very distant, like they have nothing to do with Janesville or Rock County or with Wisconsin, but they are really a lot closer than you think. On one hand, certainly housing in California is much, much more expensive. The median home in LA now costs nearly $1 million, more than triple what it is here in Janesville. You need to earn more than $200,000 a year for that home to be considered affordable. That's a $7,000 a month mortgage and nearly $200,000 down payment. In that sense, yes, the crisis is much, much worse in California and Los Angeles than it is here. But on the other hand, when I look around the rest of the country, and that includes here, what I see is almost every other city and town doing really exactly what got Los Angeles where it is today. I see plans and zoning codes that were written in the 50s and 60s and 70s that haven't been updated since. I see most development taking the form of fiscally, environmentally unsustainable sprawl with lower cost housing types either illegal at worst or infeasible at best. I see communities that are betting their futures and really more importantly, their children's futures on the hope that if they don't plan for more residents, then more residents simply won't come. And with very few exceptions, I see the same indecision, the same delay, the same inaction that has really defined California. I also see very similar results, albeit a few decades behind in some cases, as the fruits of a growing and really strong economy take the form of higher land values and more unaffordable housing rather than actually improving quality of life. And as I said, this really comes at the greatest expense to future generations who already face a lot of headwinds with student debt, with AI in the job market, things of this nature. Housing is just one more thing on top of all of that. Los Angeles really is reaping what it has sowed from many years of inaction. Homes that cost more than double what the typical middle class family can afford, the highest rate of overcrowded housing in the nation, famously torturous commutes that is very much related to our housing policy. Businesses struggle to pay their employees wages high enough to make housing even slightly affordable, and wages are quite high. And a huge share of our budget goes towards solving homelessness problems and housing problems that we mostly created for ourselves. More than $1 billion each year is spent on homelessness out of a budget of about $13 billion. Worst, we have utterly failed the nearly 50,000 people who have no place to call home on any given night in our city. That's 1 in every 85 residents, about 7 of whom die on our streets every day. When I started giving these presentations, that number was 3 a day, then it was 4, it is now 7. It's only been 4 or 5 years. This was all done in the name of protecting our unique neighborhood character. That may sound familiar. These are the things that made LA special, that residents most loved and appreciated about living there. The really sad irony is that we could not have destroyed those things more effectively if we had been trying to. I am sure you have all seen toddlers hugging little pet dogs or cats. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. The juxtaposition of pure, innocent love being expressed by the child and the look of desperate fear on the part of the pet. It's adorable. We, of course, record it for posterity. But if the kid doesn't learn to stop, we start to worry about the kind of person that they're going to grow up to be. The reason I bring this up, if I can make a bit of a strained metaphor, is that loving something does not mean holding it so tightly that it can't breathe. We do not want our communities looking like that cat. We allow the things that we love to exist and evolve separately from us because they don't exist solely for our personal gratification. They are not museum pieces to satisfy our sense of nostalgia. Most of us eventually absorb that lesson when it comes to pets and other people, but not so much in my experience when it comes to neighborhoods. In LA, we made the mistake of believing that we could build a great place and then freeze it in time, and that no one else would ever want to be a part of the thing, this wonderful thing, that we had built. We believed that the built environment was more essential to the character of our neighborhoods than the neighbors themselves. Too many people still believe those things implicitly, even if they don't think about it very actively, and we're really living in the world that they have created. What I want to emphasize is that from a housing policy perspective, California's jurisdictions are not so different from other communities across the country. What really distinguishes LA from most other places is we just grew up earlier. Rising demand for housing hit us earlier and it hit us harder, but most communities are headed in the same direction. They're just a few years or maybe a few decades behind on that same path. Doing nothing does not prevent change, it just keeps you on whatever trajectory you're on. And in most communities across America, it is not a good trajectory that we're on. The good news is that it is possible to change course before you end up with LA-sized problems, before they become more entrenched. I find that the longer you wait, the worse things get. Actually, the harder it becomes to solve these problems. It might feel that, well, if things get bad enough, that will really motivate change and we'll finally be able to solve this. That is not my experience in Los Angeles. I find that it just makes it harder. You have more entrenched interests, more people with more to lose. And so I really encourage you to act as soon as possible when you have more options and when the solutions that are required are not quite so dramatic. So returning to my book, The Affordable City, this is really very much about policy, but as I said earlier, I tend to focus on bigger picture priorities in presentations like this. And I do that because policy ideas are relatively easy to come by. And in scholarly and professional circles, there's fairly broad agreement, I will not say universal agreement, but fairly broad agreement about what it takes to improve housing affordability. The challenge really is not coming up with a list of effective policies, it's adopting those policies in a world of trade-offs, where you have winners and losers and unintended consequences, and where changing course is always hard, even when we know that the status quo is not working for us. The challenge really is convincing people that they will be better off in some alternate future, and then helping them to imagine and create that future together, and doing so really in a way that balances a lot of competing needs and interests. So my framework, again, for thinking about these trade-offs is the 3 S's: supply, stability, subsidy, and I'm gonna go through those just briefly here, starting with supply. So supply is really about making sure, there we go, that we have enough homes to meet both current and future needs, not just to accommodate population growth, but to improve the housing stock over time, adapt to demographic changes like an aging population, shrinking household sizes. It's about managing long-term economic and technological shifts like rising incomes, which increase demand for housing, increasing remote and hybrid work, which also increases demand for housing space. And it's about meeting other goals like preserving open space, growing employment, whatever your priority might be, housing probably has a central role in it. It's not a coincidence that I list supply first among the 3 S's, both here and in my book. I start here because the mismatch between housing supply and housing demand is the root cause of unaffordability in most US cities and wealthy nations of the world. Housing scarcity and housing affordability are mutually exclusive. You will not find a city in America where both are present because they really can't exist. They can't coexist, I should say. Housing abundance is not always enough to achieve affordability. I think it rarely is enough by itself, but you can't have an affordable city without it. Fundamentally, prioritizing housing supply is about acknowledging that we live in a world of physical and economic constraints. Physically, we just need the space. Sorry, gone too far. Growing, aging, increasingly wealthy population requires a growing and improving stock of homes. I think that's pretty clear. The United States is a very unequal place, and that includes the housing market, but you cannot redistribute your way out of a shortage. You have to build things as a part of the solution to a shortage. Related to that is the economic reality that homeowners and landlords gain market power when housing is scarce. That power comes at the expense of home buyers and renters, and ultimately out of the pockets of future generations. And I don't even mean to frame this as like homeowners versus home buyers, landlords versus tenants. Really, this is about needing a balance where neither one is really advantaged over the other, because society does really suffer when that occurs. We have decades and decades of empirical evidence, and the evidence is getting stronger all the time, linking a greater supply of housing to greater affordability, and conversely, linking scarcity to faster rent and price growth. To be clear, I think people sometimes hear housing abundance, housing supply, and just think we're saying you just need more units. And that's certainly part of it, but it's also about how suitable the housing is to a community's various and always changing needs. So you have needs for single adults to large families, from birth to early career to retirement, urban to rural, just what someone who's in their 20s needs today versus what someone who was in their 20s needed 50 years ago. All of these things are changing, and your housing supply has to be able to respond and adapt to those changes. The point is not that every community needs to be doing the same things or building the same amount or building the same types of things. It's just that most need to be doing more, both in the number and the diversity of homes coming on the market. Also, and I think we'll get to this maybe in one of the questions, it is just a fact that if every community were chipping in, and many are not right now, then none would actually have to change all that much. When it's a shared burden, no one really has to carry all that much. So next up is stability, probably the most controversial of the 3 S's in my experience. As a goal, stability is really about striving to ensure that when change comes to a community, and building out your supply is something that changes a community, that does not mean it comes at the expense of the people who are already struggling the most. The fact is that a rising tide does not always lift all boats. It is why the highest rates of homelessness are found not in our poorest cities, but our wealthiest. Stability is not about making museums of our neighborhoods or about absolving people of responsibility if they choose not to pay their rent or their mortgage. It is about providing some measure of security and predictability and dignity for everyone who does their part and follows some basic rules. But to put this more philosophically, which I don't often get to do as a quantitative researcher, if supply is about these kind of hard-nosed economic and physical constraints in the market, then for me, stability is about acknowledging our moral obligations as members of a society. There's a mutual responsibility that requires some basic protections against things like exorbitant rent increases, unwarranted eviction, things of that nature. In the past, I think, especially in the US, the attitude toward housing stability was that if you wanted security and predictability, you should just buy a home. And that has always been a flawed idea. One reason is that we have not, and still in many ways, do not have equal access to homeownership in America. Racial and ethnic and class discrimination is not a fully resolved problem. And past policies like urban renewal and redlining still shape our present-day neighborhoods in really meaningful ways. But even if you could put all that aside, which you should not, but if you could, and this idea that just buy a home if you want stability, it just is not the argument that it might have been 40 or 50 years ago. At that time, homes cost 1 or 2 times the typical annual salary, and that salary was often of a single breadwinner. Now there are very few places in the country where you can buy a home for less than 4 or 5 times the median income of a 2-earner household. In many cities, the ratio is 6 or 7 or 8 to 1. It's still relatively low here at around 4, maybe a little closer to 5 to 1, but that is a lot higher than it used to be, certainly. In LA, it is almost 12 to 1. That is your entire pre-tax household income, 12 times over to afford a home, the typical home. Stabilizing policies, to be clear, do not need to be so strong. They should not be so strong that landlords lose all their rights, nor should they be so strong that they erode profitability and housing supply dries up. If they do those things, they have failed. My argument really in the book and here is just that we need a better balance. The balance is off today. And the right balance is going to be different in California than it is in Wisconsin. And it's probably going to be different in Janesville than it is in Milwaukee or even in Madison. I think I got to stop clicking accidentally over here. The final S is subsidies. In many parts of the economy, after I get to talk about the left-coded stability, now I get to talk glowingly of markets. In many parts of the economy, well-designed markets serve most people more efficiently and effectively than government. I believe that very strongly. Markets have incredible power, and that goes for the housing market as well. But no one believes that markets are infallible, and no matter how well designed the market, no matter how much housing it produces, it is not going to meet everyone's needs. By the same token, stabilizing policies are important and valuable, but they're really best suited to protecting people from worsening circumstances, like rising rents or eviction. They do not have much power to proactively improve people's lives, and improving lives should be our ultimate goal. Supply and stability policies both leave gaps, and subsidies are an important tool for filling them, whether to support affordable housing development, to fund long-term rent assistance, provide shorter-term assistance like transitional housing, to operate homeless shelters, any number of uses in those spaces. Without subsidies, people who could have quickly gotten back on their feet with a little support can instead end up falling into much worse circumstances, ultimately requiring much more intensive, longer-term, and costlier assistance down the road. They're a way, when done right, of making voluntary investments in people and in communities today so that we do not have to rescue them at much greater expense in the future. Meanwhile, them having to suffer through the trauma of those experiences. So to just take a step back after having reviewed the 3 S's, the very basic insight here underlying all of them is just that different people and different communities have different needs, and their needs change over time. As simple and obvious as that sounds, the way we talk about housing and the policies that we promote rarely reflect that reality. Given the diversity of needs and circumstances, it is just impossible to serve everyone adequately with just one tool or policy or one housing type or neighborhood type, or by prioritizing only supply or only stability or only subsidy. A new market rate apartment, for example, has been shown to slow rent growth across the housing market within a metro area or city, but it doesn't do anything for someone facing an imminent eviction. Supportive housing is effective at reducing homelessness, but it doesn't keep homeownership within reach of the middle class. And the point is that that's perfectly okay. No single policy or program can do it all. They're not supposed to. The point is that each of the three S's has the power to shore up weaknesses and cover blind spots of the others so that the sum is more, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. To do this effectively, though, we have to first recognize and acknowledge that each priority does have weaknesses and blind spots, and that is hard for some people to do when they have a priority and their policy might cost someone else something. So as you might imagine, not everyone is on board with the holistic approach. Some people really like the points in favor of supply policies like upzoning, minimum lot size reform, maybe not so much stabilizing policies like rent stabilization, eviction protections, or they might feel exactly the opposite, vice versa. Or they'll like the idea of more subsidized affordable housing, but not reforms to increase production of housing built for profit, or again, vice versa. So they'll pick one or two policies or priorities and just kind of toss out the rest. Here we go. My very strong recommendation, again here and in the book, is to think about supply, stability, and subsidy as a three-legged stool for affordable communities. Something that is sturdy and resilient when all the legs are in place, but if you remove any one, the whole thing topples over. It becomes much more fragile. Supply without stability can create unnecessary harm. It adds housing, but often without any real regard for where or what will do the most good or the least harm, like displacing existing residents. Supply without subsidies can leave households with too little money left over for food, transportation, healthcare, other essentials, and sometimes not even enough to afford even the lowest quality housing on the market. Stability without subsidy or without supply is really not capable of improving conditions by and large, and instead is a way of managing or forestalling decline. Subsidy without stability can leave people without housing security, and when you lack housing security, it is harder to get ahead and you're more likely to rely on public support. And last, one of the ones that hits me very hard from my personal experience, subsidy without supply is a recipe for endlessly increasing costs. This is the story of Los Angeles and why after 6 years and a few $1 billion spent on supportive housing and homelessness services, the number of people experiencing homelessness in our city was larger than it ever had been. Meanwhile, during that same period, the cost of building a 400 or 500 square foot supportive housing unit increased from an already very high $350,000 to over $600,000 per unit. We might be over $700,000 now. To be clear, I have no question in my mind that we would be worse off, the homelessness crisis would be worse if we had not spent that money, but we failed to address the underlying problem of rising rents and rising land values and supply, really. And the problem is that even though we are now helping more people out of homelessness because we're spending more on it every year than we ever have, and that is a great achievement, the number becoming homeless every year is increasing at an even faster rate. We just cannot keep up with money alone. Rents and land values and construction costs kept growing out of control, and the money we spent bought us less and less every year. So supply, stability, and subsidy really just work better together than apart. And I think once we embrace that idea, it's a lot easier to find ways to work with someone whose priority might be supply when yours is stability, or subsidy when yours is supply. So I'm gonna spend a bit more time on supply because among the three S's, supply is really the one that you have the most control over locally. It's also unmistakably the area where most cities have fallen down on the job over the past 50 years or so. So let's just first get on the same page about the state of US housing supply over the last half century or so. So this is just the US showing per capita housing production since about 1960. Even with the ups and downs that follow the economic cycle, you can see a very clear downward trend. This is, on the left, the annual per capita housing production in major metro areas across the country for 2 time periods, 1990 to 2007 in orange, 2008 to 2018 in green. It's a little old, but it's just very striking. Every one of these metro areas built less housing in the decade following the global financial crisis than in the 18 years before it, per year and per capita, so it's adjusted for the amount of time. Cities with some of the highest demand, like Los Angeles and New York City, which you'll see near the bottom, built barely any housing during either period, which really helps to explain why so many people are having to leave California and New York City in particular, because we are not even able to keep up with births, much less potential immigration and migration. And so we are exporting people to communities like yours, often with hundreds of thousands of dollars in their pocket from their overinflated home prices. And so, I'm sorry. This other chart on the right is another depiction of just how this problem has spread with very different kinds of metro areas, not just Los Angeles, but places like Dallas and Las Vegas, really converging toward very low rates of housing production over time. So given my job as a researcher, I really do my best, and especially with the podcast, we talk about a lot of different kinds of research and findings. I really do my best to accommodate different interpretations of research. It is complicated, and very smart and well-meaning and good faith people can come to different conclusions. But within the world of housing research, I really think there is almost nothing I can say with more confidence than that if you have 2 cities with similar demand, the one that builds more housing will end up more affordable in the long run. There's a really common belief that building homes attracts rich people, and those rich people moving in is what drives up the price of housing. They're the cause of increasing prices, and really at the root is the fact that we built housing for them to live in. But as understandable as I find that explanation, that does not mean it's correct, and there is a lot of evidence that it is not. The reality is that all over the country, most of the people who move into new housing are from the same metro area where that housing was built. It's usually somewhere between 60 and 80%, and about the same as the share who end up in older housing. So there's not really a preference. In most communities, the problem is coming from within, not without. If new housing really was a magnet for people from other parts of the country, like some people believe, that would mean that there are basically people out there searching on apartments.com or Zillow or whatever, looking for new buildings only with no geographic preference whatsoever. Like, I don't care if it's St. Louis or Janesville or Fresno or one of the dozen Portlands in this country. Just as long as it's got at least 10 units and is under 3 years old, I am interested. That is not how people live. We have some very strange people, very weird people in this country, but that would be the behavior of a crazy person. That's just not how people live their lives, wealthy or otherwise. What most of us actually do, and what all of us should have the freedom to do, is we get a job or a college acceptance offer, or our family grows, or it shrinks, or wants to be closer together, or wants to be further apart, or we just decide we want to live in a new city. Then we look for housing in that place. Even when we move, it is often a wrenching decision that we make in spite of what we lose when we leave. Most people do not uproot themselves without a very good reason. Most of us also don't limit our search to newly built housing, and many obviously don't even prefer it. Even if we do, we'll usually settle for older housing if new homes aren't available. And the older ones are more affordable, so it's not exactly a barrier. That's really why refusing to build new homes just exacerbates the problem. It does not change the fact that some subset of people wants to live in your city. Some also want to leave, but some want to live here, to move here. The demand is there, and people are going to move as they please. When we build housing, it has the effect of pulling people out of older, more affordable units into the newer and better stock. That creates vacancies in those older units, which builds slack into the market and helps stabilize rents and home prices. When we don't build, that upward pull turns into a downward push. People with more resources crowd out those with fewer. Upper income households push down middle income households into lower income neighborhoods, and the people already in those neighborhoods are pushed into more overcrowded conditions, or to other cities and towns or states, or in the worst case, onto the street. And to be clear, this is not just theory. We see this empirically in both the US and abroad in a very new line of research into something called migration chains or moving chains. The first study of this in the US follows the moves of literally tens of thousands of people across a dozen metros over several years. And again, because most moves happen within a metro area or within a region of a state for smaller metros, that really means that when someone moves to a new unit, a newly built home, whether it's multifamily or single family, they're usually leaving behind a vacant home somewhere nearby. And because most moves throughout people's lives are upward into something bigger or better, the homes that they leave behind are usually more affordable than the ones that they move into. If we look at the person who moves into that newly vacated unit, the same applies. They're usually leaving behind something more affordable as well. So just to put some illustrative numbers to this, you can imagine a new market rate apartment opens up and rents for $2,000 per month. That would be a screaming deal in Los Angeles, maybe kind of average-ish here, or even a little cheap. But for some places, many people, this is certainly expensive, but household A just got a promotion, they can afford it, they're tired of their old place, so they move in, leave behind an apartment that didn't meet their needs, which they were renting for $1,600. After the landlord touches it up, puts the unit back on the market, household B moves in, their new rent is $1,600, and they leave behind a unit that was $1,300. That's the second link in the moving chain. Jump ahead to the fifth link in the chain, and research shows that about half of the people moving as part of this chain earn below the city's median income, so below the midpoint, and almost a third have incomes in the bottom quintile, which is the poorest 20% of households, which is what the chart on the right is showing. When all is said and done, 100 new, relatively expensive market rate units create vacancies in somewhere between 30 and 50 units of housing in these much more affordable places. This is housing that is priced at levels that you could not build new without very significant subsidies. This obviously directly benefits the people moving into these homes that have become vacant, but increasing vacancies and limiting landlords' power to raise rents, by doing those things, it also benefits the much larger pool of tenants who stay put, and it does so at no cost to the public. It keeps their rent from going up as quickly so they can stay if they choose to. None of this is to say that market rate homes are a perfect substitute for subsidized affordable housing. What it shows, though, for me, is that the two are complementary in a way that many people don't appreciate. Market rate homes stabilize rents and prices and ensure a continuously improving housing stock. And by stabilizing prices, they actually make subsidies go further, whether you're a community that spends a lot on them or just a little. Recently, a similar study came out in I think, Honolulu, somewhere in Hawaii, and show this quote here. This is also a moving chain. They looked at a single new condo building that actually had a mix of market rate units and affordable units. Affordable is in quotes here, I think, because I think the market rate units were about $1 million and the affordable ones were like $600,000 or $700,000. Great deal. But I just thought this specific anecdote was very poignant. Clearly not a common story, but it just illustrates the interconnectedness of this vast range of housing types and affordability levels. If anyone can't read it here, essentially someone who moved into one of those lower income units left a quite low rent unit that someone from a shelter, a homeless shelter, moved into. And so in a very real way, the opening of this like $600,000 or $700,000 unit, however much it was, actually created a vacancy in a homeless shelter that wouldn't have been there otherwise. One of my really strongest convictions is that we have to move past this idea that you can incentivize only affordable housing production while discouraging or ignoring market rate housing. And when I say affordable, I mean renting for below the market rate, maybe subsidized, maybe not. This idea that we can only have affordable communities by building mostly subsidized affordable housing. Again, this is a totally understandable view and very common, but I think it is ahistorical, for one, believing that that's the only path forward, and it ignores the very large differences in affordability between cities with quite similar levels of affordable housing investment. Many cities and countries build a lot of market rate and a lot of subsidized below market housing, but I'm actually not sure I could name a single one that built a large amount of affordable housing but very little market rate housing. In the real world, there's just no such thing as pro-affordable housing but anti-market rate housing. It really is either pro-housing, period, or anti-housing, period, in practice. Another reason I focus on supply in these presentations is to emphasize how building more homes and more diverse types of homes is not just a burden we have to bear. It's not just eating our vegetables, something we have to get over with to, have a healthy life or healthy community. Growth comes with challenges, and they are not always fairly or equally distributed, but growth is also what gave us all of the things and places that we value today, including places like this building that we're in right now. It is an opportunity to build a better future for ourselves and for others. Opposing growth is in some ways an admission that our best days are behind us. And that's something that I refuse to accept for my own community or really on behalf of any other community. In most of the US today, housing affordability is fundamentally a problem of demand outstripping supply. And what I hope you will all appreciate and encourage your friends and neighbors to appreciate is that being in demand, having high demand, is a good problem to have. Your kids want to stay here when they grow up. Others want to come here and put down roots. People want to invest their time and their money in your community, and that means new shops and hospitals and infrastructure, new and better services, new friends and employees and neighbors. That kind of opportunity is a blessing, not a curse. With demand comes options, and those can be harnessed and turned into something positive. There are countless cities and towns across America that would give anything to have a problem like that, many not too far from here. On that note, kind of skipping ahead here, but there we go. I really come to view cities and towns as having three possible futures in a very broad sense. If you're in demand, then growth is inevitable, but you do have some power over the form it takes, depending on your response. One possibility is you channel that demand into a growing housing stock. The other is channeling it into higher home prices and rents, because demand is going to find an outlet, and those are really the two channels for them to realize that. If you build, it is possible to keep housing abundant and affordable. If you don't, you essentially force people into this cruel game of musical chairs where those with the fewest resources are left with nowhere to sit and really more to the point, nowhere to sleep when the music stops. And down that path lies worsening affordability, deteriorating homes, declining numbers of children and closing schools, overcrowding, supercommuting, homelessness. Down that path lies Los Angeles. The third option is reserved for places without much demand, places that are stagnating or in decline. I don't think anyone here wants to solve your affordability challenges by wrecking your economy, and I don't think you want to follow LA down path number 2, so call me crazy, but I think it has to be the first option. Another way of putting this is on the right. You can have a community that is appealing, affordable, and unchanging, but you can only pick 2. If it's appealing and unchanging, it is not going to be affordable, not for long. This describes places that draw a lot of people but build very little housing, big cities like LA and New York, smaller ones like Berkeley and Boulder. If your city or town is unchanging and affordable, that is a pretty sure sign that it is lacking appeal. This is the story of many cities after deindustrialization that have not gotten back on their feet still. If your city is appealing and affordable, then change is coming. you will not remain unchanging. People are coming whether you plan for them or not, and that is their right, and you can focus on the negatives of that and let it paralyze and overwhelm you, or you can do the work and really turn that to your benefit as best as possible. Coming near the close here, I've talked about some of what research says about policies to improve affordability, but I mentioned at the start that I think the problem really ultimately, and I think the people in elected office will particularly agree with this, the problem is ultimately political. It's about convincing our neighbors to join us on this different path, and that is much more complicated than any research study or any development project. Sorry, developers. Fortunately, there is some good news here, and so I'm gonna close this out with extremely researchy, peer-reviewed paper kind of slides. So recently, some colleagues at a couple UC schools published a study in which they surveyed thousands of Americans asking what they thought would happen if prices if there was a sudden change in the supply of various goods and services, what's known as a supply shock. When it came to things like grain or wages in the case of labor supply, people generally answered correctly. They said that a sudden flood of additional supply would push down prices. Those people are represented by the gray parts of each bar here. People were especially likely to answer correctly when asked about a negative supply shock, so a reduction in the car market, and I think that might have been because we had just experienced that with COVID, a very abrupt reduction in the supply of new cars that very, very quickly cascaded down to a 50% increase in the price of used cars. But when asked the same question in the same survey about a sudden glut of homes, only 30 to 40% of people answered this correctly, compared to somewhere between 60 and 80 or 90 for these other questions. My initial reaction from this study was that this is just a big bummer, this sucks, and just one more barrier for reformers and people like me to overcome, that despite the evidence, people were just not buying this idea that more homes translates to improved affordability. But reading further, the researchers found that most people were not at all confident in their views on housing. Skepticism was their default view when it came to housing, and maybe that's because of how developers are presented in media and culture. Maybe it's because so few of us have actually experienced a positive supply shock of housing in our lifetimes. We don't really know why, but the survey revealed that this skepticism was not a strongly held position, and so maybe people could change their minds. That was kind of my positive spin on that paper at the time. Fast forward to about a year later, and the same authors published a follow-up, and this one was looking at different informational interventions, as they called it, just explanations of the housing crisis and how to solve it, kind of arguing in favor of supply. And here, I'm losing it. There we go. Here, when offered different explanations about the effect of increased supply on home prices and rents, people, not all people, not even most people, but many people, much more than you see in this kind of study normally, revealed themselves to be very open-minded and persuadable on this issue of housing. If you have ever been to a public hearing for a housing proposal in your community, then the idea that people are open-minded and persuadable on housing may sound very, very wrong. Many of the people at those meetings are not open-minded, they are not persuadable. In many cases, they are not even decent. But that is not the point. Or really, in some ways, it is exactly the point, because what it shows is that the people who show up to the meetings, who call their council members to oppose change, who refuse to negotiate or compromise, they are not representative. The reason housing reformers have been successful at the end of the day, and they are succeeding across the country, is that we are engaged in an educational project. We are helping people to unlearn some of their unfounded or out-of-date assumptions, and we try to do that as open-hearted and kindly as possible. And although that takes time, it is working because most people actually are open to the conversation. Most people are not the person yelling at the public hearing. They're just sitting at home, during that public hearing, not really feeling particularly strongly about the project one way or the other, which is why they didn't show up. But if you have a conversation with them, I find that people tend to be very open-minded about these issues. So that really has given me a lot of hope, and that we're going to ultimately solve a lot of these problems, even if they are going to take time, because we've been creating these problems for literally decades. But I hope it leaves you with a little bit of hope as well. I'm going to close by just restating something from earlier. I want to encourage you to certainly tackle your housing problems with a clear sense of costs and trade-offs, and that's really what the supply stability subsidy model is all about, but also to tackle these challenges with optimism and with positivity. The best places that I visit are the ones where residents exude this feeling that the best is yet to come. And that is something that, in my experience, much of California, a lot of coastal cities, a lot of more expensive places, have lost. And I believe that it is something worth preserving, worth cultivating. I think Forward Janesville is the kind of organization that is really designed to do exactly that. Every place has its problems and its warts, but if you're struggling with affordability, it means that you've built a wonderful community that others want to share in and contribute to, and that's exactly what they're doing when they move here from other places. So embrace that, encourage your friends and neighbors to do the same. I strongly, fervently believe that our towns and our cities are not so fragile that they will be ruined by more people. If you love where you live today, show your appreciation by ensuring that the opportunities you enjoyed here are not closed off to future generations. Let it change, and let it welcome people in the same way that it welcomed you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane, for that insightful information. So we're going to do the Q&A now.
Should we
and
get the
we got to get the
stools?
Yeah. But first, we're going to ask everyone to take a few moments to do an event evaluation. So we're going to leave that up for a couple minutes while we imagine Shane
Do we want to be like dead
his
center
cat.
here, or what do we?
Yeah. So we just visualize you squishing your poor little kitty cat. I'm never going to forget that.
Don't let me block.
All right, did you guys do this? Oh, look at you doing the evaluation. Thank you. It's always nice when people actually do things like. And Megan wants you to do the evaluation. If you don't do the evaluation, she's going to bomb your email tomorrow.
The key is to just stand silently and wait.
Okay.
Should I keep that on?
I think we're going to keep it on. All right, now we're going to go to the questions. All right. So we have a question from someone who is looking for thoughts on integrating supported housing for individuals with disabilities into communities the size of Janesville. The reference was Home of Our Own, which is a 501c3 nonprofit associated with affordable housing for adults with disabilities in partnership with community-based nonprofits in the Wisconsin town of New Glarus, which they make really good beer over there. We didn't make it there yet. Have you worked with any of these projects or know of any of these success stories, and what financial considerations should we be aware of, and what makes the project successful? So first of all, do you know of any of these?
So I am by no means an expert on supportive housing or homelessness policy, which is in some ways certainly overlaps a lot with housing policy, but is distinct also in important ways. I do know a little bit about supportive housing. Actually, one of our episodes, we did an 8-part series on homelessness on UCLA Housing Voice. One of the last episodes, maybe the very last episode, was on, or I think the 6th or 7th in that series, was with, his last name was Aubrey, Tim Aubrey, who worked on a randomized controlled trial, a huge study of permanent supportive housing in Canada, the highest quality study that's been done on it really a decade or more ago. And for those who are not aware, supportive housing, permanent supportive housing, is essentially generally for people who have been or were recently homeless, have some kind of other problems they're dealing with other than just like, you know, can't afford housing. Maybe they have a mental illness, maybe that they're dealing with drug addiction, and it's providing not only housing to them, but often pretty intensive services alongside of it. And so that's often important for ensuring that people can stay housed, but it's also more intensive, more expensive in some ways. I will say, I don't think that I can give a really in-depth answer to this question, so I'll just focus on one thing that I think that I see that bothers me about how I see supportive housing being implemented, which is it is almost exclusively 100% supportive housing buildings. So every unit, often, we're talking 50, 100 units, is all for people who are, similarly really, really struggling. And on the one hand, I think the reason that is done is you're kind of concentrating services and there's a clear benefit to that. But in our conversation with Tim Aubrey, he said in their study, none of the places, for one, none of them even had services on site. They were just existing multifamily buildings that they gave people vouchers for to be able to afford. And they made sure that none of the buildings had more than 20% of their population in them. And so I think in some cases you can have 100% supportive housing building with intensive services for every person, but I think that can also obviously cause problems where some tenants are causing problems for others, and that makes it difficult for everyone. And having a smaller population, more spread out, I think can work better for at least some of the population. So that's one thing I would encourage you to think about, is just not to say that either one is necessarily better, but not to go all in on either one, because people have different needs.
Thank you. Your framework emphasizes supply, stability, and subsidy working together. How can a mid-sized city like Janesville realistically balance all three at once, especially when political appetite may only exist for one or two? So you talked about this a little bit earlier, but maybe a little deep dive on that.
So it's a great question, and there's certain things that cities cannot do. Again, part of why I focus on supply in a lot of these presentations and conversations is that in essentially every community in the country, it is primarily the responsibility of the local government to zone and set development standards and fees and provide the infrastructure and everything else. Sometimes states step in and say, you're not doing enough, but they don't take away the authority. It does really rest with the local government. But at the same time, especially with things like stability policies, even very mild forms of rent stabilization, for example, or eviction protections, many states just preempt cities from passing anything like that. And obviously some people support that, some people oppose that. I think that's going too far. So I don't know where Wisconsin is on that. I would not be surprised if you guys have that policy, like any kind of rent stabilization preempted. But that's the kind of thing where it's got to be a lot more kind of tinkering around the edges, frankly. There's probably some things you can do on eviction protections. I've seen policies like at least setting a minimum where someone has to be behind by $500 on rent before you can serve them an eviction instead of, 1 penny or more. These are the kinds of things that still, I think, balance the interests of the landlord, where it is important when someone is paying and committed to not paying to getting them out quickly. But you also don't want it to be like a hair trigger kind of situation either. And then, longer term, I think it's just, this is where it comes back to politics, frankly, and having to, if you believe in these things, pushing for them, maybe starting locally, maybe starting at the state level, because I think there are some things where trying to do it at every local government independently is just really inefficient, not going to be very effective. In some ways, it's better to have the same protections statewide, so everyone kind of knows the rules they're playing by and doesn't have to figure them out from border to border. And then on subsidy, I think that's also a challenge. The higher up you go in government, the federal government has a lot more money, obviously, and it can also run deficits, whereas state and local governments cannot. And so state and local government's ability to spend a bunch on subsidy, even if a lot of it or all of it's going to be paid back, is limited in some respects. I will say, I have found that when it comes to subsidy, aside from making the most of the low-income housing tax credit and making sure that your housing voucher program is working as well as possible, those are both federal programs, but they're administered locally. I think something that cities can really do if they have that power, is using property tax abatements as a form of subsidy. It's something that you can actually create a lot of subsidy that way. Portland, Oregon is a good example where they've had an inclusionary zoning requirement for a decade or so. This is requiring 10, 15, 20% of units to be rented at below market prices to low-income households. That actually really cratered their production for a while, and they just recently passed a policy where they still mandate the affordability, but they give a 10-year property tax exemption for those projects that is intended to fully offset the cost, the loss of value from those affordable units. And at some level, there's like a cost there where you are probably subsidizing some projects that would have gone forward either way, but you're also probably allowing some to go forward that wouldn't have, and giving up just 10 years of property tax for a building that might last 100 years is not a great price to pay, plus you're getting those affordable units. Yeah.
In Janesville, housing is emerging as a top barrier to workforce growth. How should communities reframe housing policy as economic infrastructure, not just social policy, to gain broader business support?
I mean, I feel like the business support is generally there in most places I go to. I mean, I think that's true here. The business community is usually in favor of more supply. I think that because businesses and business organizations tend to have, larger members who have larger corporations and so forth that are members, because they have the resources and the extra staff who can go to the meetings and everything. I think the perspectives of like the larger scale developers are well represented, but the perspectives of the smaller scale developers are not so well represented, not just in the business community, but just broadly. And in many ways, that is what we need to be doing a lot more of. Really need to be doing a lot more of everything, but that in particular. And so I think finding a way to identify those people and bring them in somehow, I think they're very effective advocates, in part because they're building the kind of housing that people really identify with. And they're often people who people really identify with. They're often people who live in the community, who are building in their community, using their own money, friends and family, because they're building at a scale where that is possible. And so I think that's really an opportunity. And I'll just say more broadly that yes, housing as an affordability measure, yes, housing as social policy, yes, housing as economic development. I think the great thing about good housing policy is it kind of checks all the boxes, whatever your priorities are, whatever your politics are, right or left or center, you can find the thing that you care about, and policy has some real nexus to it, and doing housing policy right will further your goals. And so I think it's really less about focusing on one argument or another and making sure that you have the whole package and are making that comprehensive case, and that you are delivering the right message to the right audience. It's fine to say to one audience, hey, housing reform is a racial justice issue, and not saying that to another audience that is going to immediately tune out because you said that. That's perfectly fine. It's just knowing your audience. It is not misleading. It's just the fact is it does a lot of good things, and you should find the thing that the people you're trying to convince care about and make that case to them.
Thank you. Earlier today, we talked a lot about the missing middle and housing types beyond a single-family home. We talked about duplexes, townhomes, and small multifamily in communities like Janesville where land is available, but zoning culture is still restrictive. Can you give us some effective ways to promote building the missing middle back up?
I do think it's, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, backyard cottages, whatever you want to call them.
Granny condos.
Granny flats, yeah. In Canada, they call them laneway houses. There's a million different names for them. But these are just smaller detached or attached homes on an existing, usually single-family lot. And they're controversial too. There's no housing policy that is uncontroversial, but they have proven to be quite effective both at getting passed and actually producing homes when they're designed well. And those homes, just by nature of being smaller and really not much else, are a lot more affordable than like a full-size detached home on a large lot. And I think it's often, as I said, no place has passed even an ADU policy, which is kind of the most incremental supply policy you can do. No place has proposed or passed one without controversy. Many places have tried and had to give up this year and come back a year or two later. Oftentimes they do succeed the next time. But I also can't think of anywhere that has passed one and undone it. And oftentimes, once people see that, we passed the ADU law, some people thought the sky was gonna fall, nothing really seemed to change all that much from day-to-day perspective, other than there were some extra homes.
So Janesville is rewriting our zoning code for those who don't know, and you had some numbers earlier of communities that had the ADU policy in place, and then what was the number of actual ADUs built in those communities?
Well, I think I was talking about California.
Yeah.
So yeah, California passed some ADU laws at the state level to make it legal, to require cities to allow them, firstly, and then it passed a series of laws to actually make it easier to do so as well. And those first two laws passed in 2016, and in that year, before they went into effect, we built around 1,000 ADUs statewide, and the last several years, we've been building 30,000 a year statewide. And that's a lot. It's also, the state of California should be building about 300,000 units a year, and we only build 100,000. And so ADUs are an important part of the solution, but they really are just kind of a first step. You're not going to solve a housing crisis with ADUs, especially, kind of the further along you are. It's just not enough. But I will say, one advantage to ADUs and some other small scale like this is if you can make a policy that allows people to add housing to lots that already have housing, rather than having to tear down housing and replace it with more housing, that lowers the barrier significantly. ADUs are the most obvious version of that, but Portland, for example, again, allows up to 3 or 4 units in the backyard in many places, and they see much more uptake when they can just add those units to the main house versus having to tear it down, vacate for several years, build all 4 units or whatever it happens to be. So that incremental without demolition is a really good starting point.
Thank you. My daughter's here, so now she's gonna start digging a basement in my backyard, building a house. So your recommendations include by right development and faster approvals. How can cities streamline approvals without losing community trust, especially in places where development skepticism is rising?
So I think that this idea that discretionary approvals, which is essentially the zoning code says you can build X, and the developer shows up and says, I would like to build X. And then the city council or the planning commission or the staff or whatever say, could you build X minus 2? Something smaller, something more affordable, something more expensive, basically. Could you do more than what we actually asked for in our plans? And that is it's just creates a lot of uncertainty, for sure, but I think it actually creates a lack of trust. I totally understand where people are coming from, but I think people in planning departments, in elected office, feel that they are negotiating on behalf of their constituents for a better deal. But I think what a lot of constituents actually see is, here's what the code says you could build, and you negotiated a bigger project in exchange for affordable units and blah, 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 but all they see is, it said you could only build this, but you got to build that. And so I think it actually erodes trust when people cannot trust in the plans that have been developed. And so I think the trade-off really is, yes, you're not gonna debate the particulars of individual projects because you're gonna spend a lot more time on the planning process that involves the whole community, and actually works at having true representation and getting as many voices as possible, adopting those plans, and then when someone shows up and wants to build what the plan says without any meaningful modifications, they get to build it, and the 3 neighbors who live nearby don't get to have an effective veto over the hundreds or thousands of people that actually took part in the planning process.
Well, and earlier you talked about it made projects cheaper, right? And it made our community potentially more attractive to developers because they would just have by right opportunity and wouldn't have to go through extension processes.
If you have to account for maybe I'm gonna have to downsize my project, maybe I'm gonna have to lower the rent on some units such that the value of the project is lower, but I'm not, offsetting that with any additional value elsewhere or reduced cost, then that additional risk or the risk of rejection, even though I propose something that's compliant, I'm gonna have to, like when I go to my potential investors, they're gonna expect a higher return because the risk of losing money or the whole investment potentially is higher. And so I think we often think of kind of sticking it to developers as imposing requirements lowers their profit. In practice, it lowers what they can pay for land, so it lowers what the landowners in the city can get, but it probably increases their profit in the long run because they actually have to earn higher profits in order to make a project to bring investors on board.
All right, it's a hard question now. Janesville's business community is optimistic about growth because they built businesses. They've taken out huge loans. They understand the risk involved in that. Residents express mixed confidence. They may not have ever taken on debt like that, and they don't understand how that all works. How can local leaders align these perspectives to build coalitions that you describe as necessary for housing reform?
So I definitely think that the development community, in my experience, maybe this is just California, Los Angeles, I don't think it is. I think the development community shows up to things like this. They show up to things that are in support of their work, but as a group, not speaking for every single developer, obviously, they often don't show up for other people's priorities in the same way. And I get it, because sometimes those priorities are at odds with what developers are trying to do. So I think there's a challenge there. I guess part of where I would go with this, not to just say like larger developers don't have a place here, but I think they're pretty engaged. I think this really could benefit though from, again, bringing more small scale developers into the fold and making it so that both the housing that's being built is more kind of recognizably similar to what's already in many communities. Probably still gonna be denser, bigger, obviously newer, but a little closer where it's not just single family homes or 5 or 7 story 100-unit apartment buildings. I think bringing those people in both for what they're building, for where the money's coming from, probably coming from more locally, and for who is building it. Those are all part of the answer here, I think. I think beyond the benefits of this smaller middle scale of housing just being more affordable naturally, I think who is building it, who is lending for it, what it looks like, all these things actually make these reforms feel more like something that people feel is meeting a need that it continues to be missing.
All right, this is a good one. Am I out? No.
They've all been good.
Okay. You suggest governments should consider how they use publicly owned land, like 2400 Beloit Avenue. How should a city like Janesville evaluate whether to sell, lease, or strategically hold land to support long-term affordability?
So I don't think there's a like hard and fast rule here where you always want to always sell, always, ground lease, always one thing or another. But my general principle for this is developers have like a 10-year horizon. Affordable units are often affordable for 30 years or so. Some places require longer, but then they revert to market rate. Cities in concept are forever, and so when they give up land, that is land that is gone forever. If they ever want it back, it's probably gonna be a lot more expensive. Successful cities, at least, land only ever gets more valuable. And so I think giving it up can be short-sighted, even though obviously there are reasons for it, budget crunches, there's a million reasons to just sell it or to give it away for free and get some affordable units, especially when you're in the midst of a housing crisis and a lot of people need help as quickly as possible. But I think it is, at the same time, incumbent on city leadership to really think about the position that whoever follows them is going to be in 10 years from now, 50 years from now, and how their options are kind of constrained, not just for housing, but for things like open space. Los Angeles is a very park-poor city, and if you want to build like a half-acre park, half a block or quarter block or whatever size that would be, in many places, you're spending $10 million just on land, plus the construction, and so it's just, we're kind of stuck with what we've got. And so I think it's useful to hold on to what you can.
All right, one more question. For every 100 extremely low-income households, there are only 29 adequate, affordable, and available rental units. That means two parents who both work minimum wage jobs might wait years to find a safe, affordable place for their kids to live. With such high demand, why aren't developers racing to build affordable apartments?
This is a really good question, and something that it makes me realize that I need to think about things from other people's perspective, because this is like the kind of thing that is obvious to a housing wonk and no one else. The reason is because those affordable units lose money. They cost more to build than they're worth by a lot. In Los Angeles, we're spending $500,000 to $700,000 in subsidies per unit. In Janesville, I'm guessing it's probably $150,000 to $200,000, depending on the cost. But if I haven't thought about these how this translates in a while, but I think like $100,000 is going to cost you what, like $400 or $500 in a mortgage, depending on the value. And that's just like the mortgage part of it. So if a building costs $300,000 a unit, you're at like $1,500 just to pay off the development costs, and you have property taxes and operations, which are much more expensive, like repairs and maintenance and everything else than people, I think, realize. So it's just, you cannot build housing cheap enough that extremely low-income people can afford it without subsidies, period, in almost any community. And so this is where I really think, on the one hand, we should build new housing for people with extremely low incomes. On the other hand, we should let the market build what it can to open up older housing that those people could live in, maybe still not without subsidies, but they can get a smaller amount of assistance from the city, from the state, from the federal government with the housing voucher, and live in that housing, and the rents will not be quite so high. I think we need to, it's common, understandable, I get it, to kind of compare the population of low-income people, extremely low-income people, to new supply, but there's no world, even with a lot more funding at every level of government, that we're going to meet every low-income person's housing needs, get them to that 30% of income or less for rent, just by building affordable housing. It's gonna have to be a lot of market rate housing, a lot of affordable housing, a lot of rent subsidies directly, which is a more immediate solution for people so they don't have to wait for construction.
Well, thank you, Shane. This was great, very informative.
Thank you.
So the staff of Forward Janesville, we have a gift for you from the Bodacious shops, and I think there's some cheese puzzle in there and some other items. It'll arrive soon.
Ooh, my wife loves puzzles.
Oh, good. So that's coming up here.
Although our dog doesn't.
But thank you all for attending. We will send out the questions as soon as Shane can get them answered for us. Sometimes that takes a little bit of time. And then the video will be available for you as well. So thank you all for your attendance tonight.
Thank you.